stage is dark, and on it are two lone figures. One person in the uniform of an American soldier, the other in traditional Afghan clothing. They stand across from each other, two lights against the black. The American soldier asks, why should they sacrifice for a war that began before they were even born? Why should they die surrounded by strange people in a foreign and faraway land? The young Afghan asks if their own life was nothing more than an American dream, brief, troubled, but full of promise, a dream now descending once again into darkness. Their questions to each other, forever suspended now within the stream of time. It is now August 2022, almost a year since the end of the military withdrawal from Hamid Karzai International Airport and the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Welcome to The Ask. I am your host, White Azimi, and together with my co-host, Cliff W. Gilmore, I have the privilege to welcome back to this podcast award-winning author, Elliot Ackerman. We have the honor of discussing his latest book, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan, a highly personal book that examines the arc of America's longest war through his own memories having fought in it. Set against the backdrop of one dramatic week that saw him, together with old friends and strangers, work day and night to save Afghans seeking to escape. Before we begin, I would like to extend a special thanks to Elizabeth Calamari and Molly Reed over at Penguin Random House for helping arrange for us a galley of the Fifth Act ahead of the book's release this August. And lastly, I dedicate this episode to those who managed to escape. I dedicate this episode to those who remain left behind, and every person who assisted my own father's safe evacuation from Kabul that August. Let us now meet our guest, Elliot Ackerman, and discuss The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan. Elliot, this is the second time you've guested on The Ask. I can't thank you enough again for providing your time here to talk about your latest book, The Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. It's a pleasure to be here.
I know that you're a very busy person and have a very busy travel schedule ahead. So I'd like to dive right in and get into this book and hopefully take our listeners through why it's a very important book and why it's an important book, especially as we near the 1-year anniversary of the military withdrawal from Afghanistan. Could we start with the origins of this book? In your acknowledgments, you thank both PJ Mark for suggesting what would eventually become the Fifth Act and Scott Moyers for allowing the original scope to change. Could you please share with us how PJ helped kickstart your thinking on the book and how Scott impacted the final scope of the Fifth Act for us?
I love that you asked that question because it's usually not the first one that I get, but it's a really good place to start. So kind of early to mid-August of last year, events were unfolding very, very quickly in Afghanistan. And I think one of the things that was disorienting for those of us who paid attention to the war over the years is that suddenly everyone who had kind of forgotten about Afghanistan was also paying attention to the war. And PJ is my agent and a great friend. And he just called me actually one morning, and he had been out on his morning run. And the idea that came to me said, I think it would be really good if you did if we could do like a paperback original and take some of the writing you've done in the past and maybe just, add a few things to kind of, just explain and bring people up to speed with everything that's going on right now and what this means. I think as he said, because I'm feeling disoriented watching it in the news because I have not been paying attention. And I said, that sounds great. He said, well, let's call Scott and see what Scott thinks. And so they had a conversation. And I think, we did that book deal like in a day, maybe 2 days over email. And the idea was it would be, as I said, about 30,000 words released in paperback, probably within 6 months. And we'll just sort of, situate everything this withdrawal, but more from, a political standpoint. And then the month of August kind of started progressing. The book I write about that mid-August, I had a long planned family vacation. And so we went on our family vacation and, and already the evacuations had started by the time we left, but, we were still going to go. So we went, and I only kind of weave this vacation through, not because I think anybody cares about my family vacation, but because I thought it was important to sort of just toggle the dissociative experience that it was, I think, for many of the people who were involved in this evacuation, which is for so many of us, we've left the wars. Like, we're all, we're veterans, or maybe we're activists and journalists who still are involved in Afghanistan. But I mean, we're living our post-war lives. And then we're kind of sucked back into this, and we're trying to help and do whatever we can while also still living these post-war lives. And at that moment, my post-war life was like the furthest place you could be from Afghanistan, which was vacation with my family. So I go into those sort of 2 weeks, and sort of by the end of August, I reached out to Scott. And he himself was with his family. And I said, I want to talk to you quickly. And I said, listen, I just want you to know, I think the scope of this book is going to really change, because a lot has happened and is still happening. And I think there's just this, there's like, as you guys know, like there's a story here that demands to be told. And I want to try to tell my sliver of it.
As a literary piece of work, I mean, it is absolutely fantastic. I mean, I want to gush here, but I mean, the prose is solid. It took me there, and I can't certainly can't ever make the claim to have been anywhere near in the proverbial shit. I was a headquarters guy every single time. But your book for me was therapeutic. I went to Fallujah and helped out a little, and then watched it fall. And then I went into Helmand, and Nowzad was the town I saw when it was a ghost town. You only went in there for a gunfight. And then watched that. I went into we had it back up and running, and then it fell. So to me, the watching that go was a hugely therapeutic piece of work for me. I'd done same what you had. I watched that gone through that, watching it collapse. It wasn't a surprise, but when it did hit, it was a series of worlds colliding. I'd already kind of worked through it, and then it was happening. The way you painted those threads was really a solid piece of work. I think that makes it resonate in a contemporary audience, folks who maybe don't understand the full range of what was happening. Definitely put a human perspective on it. And that's me hogging the mic and just telling you that as a piece of work, weaving those stories together, I'm thrilled to hear how you came to that and how that evolved. And I guess, not sure I'm leading to a question so much as to say that it was impressive to watch the experience, the expertise, and the humanity that was all crashing together during that time. And I commend you for being able to capture it.
Thanks. I appreciate that. A moment kind of in the formation of the book was the book's title. And it's not a play about the theater. The reference to the Fifth Act is, well, actually, the way it came about was a friend of mine asked if I would contribute an essay to her Substack. She was gathering a number of writers, and she wanted them all to post on her Substack. And frankly, it was at a moment where sort of emotionally, I didn't want to write anything about it quite then. I was feeling too raw. And I said, well, what do you even want? Like, what can I, what do you want me to do? She's like, well, I want you to, try to explain what's going on to people. A lot of people just, they don't understand why this is happening and how we got here. And I'm like, well, you want me to explain the last 20 years? She's like, yeah, and you've got 500 words. I'm like, oh God, how do you do that? And she said, well, and I was sort of like, I can't do, and I said, I can't do that. And she's like, this is just, and she sort of said, like, this is just a tragedy and people don't understand. And it was that word tragedy that for whatever reason in my mind just kind of toggled this, if you look back in classic dramatic structures, whether it's the ancients like Horace who wrote Ars Poetica, or, even the way Shakespeare structured his play, tragedies are very often told in 5 acts. And so kind of that idea popped in my head. I was like, well, it's going to at least the long arc of the 20 years will be told 5 acts: Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and the 5th act is the end game with the Taliban. And then once I had that going through the summer, I was like, there were really 5 cases that I was involved in of trying to evacuate people. And of those 5, there was a mixed result. Some were successes and some were not. I wanted to just tell the story of those cases and everyone who was involved in them, many of whom, we all had interrelated pasts. So I'm also telling about how we all know each other, which is it's a whole other story. And then the last thing I wanted to do is, I think, shot through this experience, at least for me, and I suspect for many others, is, you came out of the Marine Corps too, and it's not unique to the Marine Corps, but it's this idea of, leave no man behind. Like, what does that mean? It's not specific to the U.S. military. I mean, this is an idea that is as old as war. In the Iliad, after Achilles kills Hector and he drags his body back to his camp, Hector's father, King Priam, the king of the Trojans, comes to Achilles and begs for the body of his son. Why? Because we don't leave anyone behind in the enemy camp. So I wanted to write about an experience I had in Afghanistan in 2008 that really sort of tested me and was and my understanding and conception of what it means to not leave anyone behind. Those sort of 3 ideas were what were in my mind, and at that point I kind of could see, okay, well, I think I know how to structure this and make it into a book and a story.
Going back to what you front loaded this interview with about the fact that you were on vacation with your family. It was a long planned trip to Italy with your young children and your wife. And I was struck by that. And what I'd like to do before I get into my question is actually read a passage from your book. Prologue, a hotel room, Rome at night. The war has always been there, even though I don't go to it anymore. It is older than my children who sleep in the room next door. I learned to love it before I learned to love my wife, who fits her body beside mine in the bed. The war is ending, has been ending for some time, and it is disastrous. Kabul fell 5 days ago. From all I can see, you've led a highly guarded private life, Elliot, for most of your literary career. Yet in the very first chapter of this book, the doors are thrown open, and readers will, over the course of this telling, meet your wife, your sons, and your young daughter. Could you share with us what it was like immortalizing this snapshot of your family and the importance of their presence in this book for you?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the things that was important to me was to capture the dissociative experience of watching Afghanistan fall in the way that it fell, for so many people who fought there, for friends of mine who are Afghans who've immigrated to the United States, over the years too, to watch everything sort of collapse. So to try to capture that dissociative quality of being sucked from one life into another life. Well, the reader needs to understand the life you're getting sucked away from. And so I wanted people to, understand a little bit of my life and what it feels like and how also that dissociative quality, I think you always live with it a little bit too, because for instance, like my wife knows that I was in the wars. We weren't together then. She knows all the stories and she knows all my friends who I was there with. And, and she's very familiar with all of that. My children know I was in the war, much more abstractly, and they don't necessarily know all the stories and everything else, but then they know their uncles and, these guys who are in their lives who they see and pop up, and they know that they're dad's war buddies. And so that dissociative quality kind of has always lived there. But what was, I think, and my wife actually said, she said a number of times, she would say, this is really poignant. And I would go, what do you mean is poignant? She's just like, it's just poignant for me to have to watch you and all these people who I know, your friends, who I know in this context of, having dinner together or, just doing what regular people do every day, suddenly back like they're 26, 27 years old in Afghanistan, running operations on the phone with each other, trying to get folks out. And she just says, it's poignant for me to see that. I think at times in the book, I was talking to someone recently who said, about the book, you said, your wife in the book seems to serve the role of like the Greek chorus, kind of saying everything that's wrong, saying, oh my God, like what's going on? Don't you see how messed up this is, Elliot? Like, I can't believe this. And I was sort of laughing. I was like, well, yeah, maybe that's true. I was like, but she's also the Greek chorus of my life. She's sort of always telling me, helping me see myself when I can't see myself. That's why it was important to me, because to just solely tell the story only in Afghanistan, I think you would only be telling one half of the story, because so much of the story of this withdrawal, we're not just the people who were trying to get out of Afghanistan. Of course, that's a very important and central part of the story, but it's also a story about the small groups of people who are trying to get them out and what that meant in their lives. And I'm just one of those people. There were lots of people who you read about in the book who were in a similar position.
I'm kind of struggling on my own here in a way, and that shouldn't make it into a podcast about someone's book, or maybe it should. I don't know. I was definitely struck by the strength of family, and it stood out to me that you had brought them in and were telling that part of the story as well. And I want to express appreciation for that you were certainly willing. And I appreciate it in terms of the art of it, that the story wouldn't have been complete without including your family in that as a bit of like context for the real time. And I came away as I was going through reading that, one, grateful for my own, but also if I could even dare do it on behalf of you, that I was pleased for you that you had that family support with you and that you found that relationship to help carry you through those times. Bit of a question digging in here, I guess, on that personal side. You put your family out, brought them into the story. What thoughts do you have to share from their perspective on that as they were going through it? I mean, one could easily say, oh, this is just an example of a guy who's like on vacation but working and putting his family off. But that wasn't what was going on. I mean, it wasn't that cliche. How did that work for it from their perspective as you were going through it?
I think my kids understood it as a bit of an abstraction. There's a moment in the book, kind of halfway through, where after a lot of work, a lot of people were trying to get one family and a handful of other folks out of the airport. And it seemed kind of at moments improbable that it was going to work. One of the people we were trying to get out was a woman who was pregnant. And at the moment we were trying to get them into the airport so they could fly out, happened to be the exact same moment I was going through security at an airport with my own family. So there's this weird juxtaposition of that as I'm holding my phone. And at one point I have to send my phone through the x-ray machine as everyone's texting to kind of do this final link up. And then it worked. And an old buddy of mine from the Marine Corps, and oh, by the way, it just happened to be my old infantry battalion that was doing it by just total coincidence, 1st Battalion of the 8th Marine Regiment. And he just sends the message and it's him. And he pulled them out standing there with their arms and they're all smiling. And I got that photo and it was just, leveling, like, oh my, just, kind of a wave of emotion came over me. And, and I think my kids could see it and I showed it to my wife. And, one of the things I love about my wife is, she can cry at an ice hockey game. I mean, she's quick to tear up and she started crying. And my son sort of looked at me and, he didn't totally understand what was going on. He said, "What's wrong?" And we told him like nothing's wrong. And, and she said, they said, "Why are you guys look upset?" And my wife said, "I'm not upset. And she said, "I'm just happy for your dad. And, this is what happened." And my dad looked at me, so like, "I'm happy for you too, Pop." And he went back to his game. So, I don't know that they can totally, they get it, but they don't totally get it. But when they get older, they'll start to understand what things meant in the contour of my life story, which is part of their story and our story. And, in the way, as you guys know, events like this just connect people. A number of the folks I was working with on these things who are mentioned in the book, I had never met. Some of them I still haven't met. And those are Americans who are working together and Afghans in America who were working with us, and then Afghans who were trying to get out. I mean, some I have since met, but, just all of us now, as much as we were kind of strangers before this, now you're bound together. And that is something that's not unique necessarily to this evacuation. It's something that often happens in war. And it wasn't something that I thought was going to, again, happen in my life.
You really captured, Elliot, the power of those relationships. And, it's so easy to boil it down to a cliche of, once a Marine, always a Marine, and bands of brothers and those phrases. But in the telling of the story, the way you captured it, that too stood out so profoundly, that those bonds, there's the phrase, well, it's a tight bond, it's a bond forever. And then there's the reality that you can serve with someone and then not see them for 10 years or whatnot. And they show up on your doorstep, and they could be battered and bruised for all, and all that's there is like, "Oh, hey, unpause, welcome to my home. What do you need from me now?" And that was poignant for me, I guess, going through and seeing how you captured those relationships. Those things must have carried you tremendously.
They did carry you tremendously. Because I've been on the show with Wise talking about green on blue before, he might appreciate this anecdote. I write a little bit about my interpreter from when I was in the agency. And so the first book I ever wrote, was a story of these two brothers in Afghanistan. And I dedicated it to Ali and Big Cheese, who are my friends. Ali was my interpreter when I was in the agency. And when I left, he didn't know my last name. And I was convinced like I was probably never going to see him again. And when I wrote that book, I hadn't seen him since I'd left. And, and I dedicated the book to him and one other interpreter I was close with. And then several years after that book was published, he saw it. He had made it back to the US and he reached out to me and we finally got to, be friends again, which was great. And so we were in touch as you are in touch. And when this all started happening, I was getting in touch with everyone. I reached out to him and, we knew some of our old comrades were at the airport gate and we were trying to figure out how do we get into the airport. And, and he was calling back to old members of the unit we'd served in who were Afghans still working at that unit, calling in favors to get to get a bus of folks out for us. And we're all kind of working every channel we have in our contact book. At the same time, we've gotten his family, his father and his, and his sisters and his mother in this bus because they need to get out, because they're under threat too. And just, again, it's this collapse of time and distance and having these moments where it's, it's like suddenly 10 years have passed and it's like he and I are back in the gun truck together, running an operation. And you talk about, family, for particularly with my wife who didn't know me then, she would just sort of be watching as I'm sitting in the corner of our room on the phone, texting, doing whatever I'm doing. And she said, like, I feel like I'm getting this mirror or a window, into what that life was like for you, what it felt like when you were in the wars. This is what it must have felt like. And I'm seeing all of these people who I knew socially or just as friends suddenly reincarnated into former iterations of themselves. So, suddenly I'm like Captain Ackerman again. And suddenly, Sean is, Staff Sergeant Brownlee again. And we're all kind of doing it again, but we're just older.
Yeah, and I can imagine it just clicking in, and that's where I reference just the display of experience and expertise and perspective that was put to work. As I was reading it, my adrenaline was going as you're talking about working these coordinations and then hitting the point that it shouldn't have been you. I think your wife mentioned in the book, it raised that issue, like, why are you shouldn't be the one doing this. And it really drove home to that concept of service, that, whether you're deployed into a combat zone or whether you're back here, you still have those bonds, you have those relationships, and in a sense that duty. And what another profound piece of it to me was watching that, seeing that you stood up and put that expertise back to work. And that must have been just a whirlwind and really truly something to see from your wife's perspective, seeing you click into that mode.
I think for her, it was a lot of sleepless nights for the both of us, just being tired all the time for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, which is at the heart of most of it.
And most of it, yeah.
It's like, yeah, how do you describe it? Oh, we were just tired a lot.
Yeah, lots of coffee.
Yeah. Tabasco. Anyway,
yeah.
Wise, what else is on your mind, my friend?
Let's return back to the war for a moment, Elliot. For the next question, I'd like to read a passage from your book once again for the listeners. Everyone could feel it. In those seconds we knew, the shuttered storefronts, the deserted streets, the glimpse of a woman grabbing a child off the street. It was so obvious to be cliche. As foretold as any high noon scene in a spaghetti western, as apparent in life as it would have been on the screen when, say, the tumbleweeds blow through town, when the gunfighter cocks both his pistols and walks out in the street. You know that it's coming. The first rocket-propelled grenade went wide, fired from the north side of the street. It sailed overhead. I reached for the radio, and Lang swung left in the turret, stepping on my arm. Contact left, RPG, I shouted into the headset. Then, doing my best to sound calm and level, I added, near ambush, all vehicles pushed through the kill zone. Above my head, Lang had gotten to work, jackhammering out 3 to 5 round bursts from the automatic grenade launcher. Each 40 millimeter round is the size of an egg, and the recoil caused our Humvee to lurch to the right. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see Redbone tugging the steering wheel left while he floored the accelerator. Tactically speaking, there's only one rule when caught in an ambush: get out of the kill zone. In Shiwan, the Taliban had turned the length of this road into a kill zone. Your book reads like a thriller, made even more compelling because it's all true. This really happened. You were there, you knew them, you fought alongside them, and some of them died or were forever scarred by war. Without giving any of the story away, what was the process going back into your memories and the many battles you fought to raise this one up and to intertwine it against that August in Italy with your family?
Well, I mean, I think without giving too much away, the result of that ambush was one of our team members was killed and his body was left in that kill zone. And when we got everyone to the other side of the kill zone, we were barely combat effective, and we didn't really have the manpower to go fight our way back and get his body. So the question became, how do we get his body out? And that became a very fraught question for us. And it gets to this theme of, what does it mean to live up to that code of leave no man behind? So I've thought about that day for years and years and years. So reconstructing that day, it's not like it's not difficult because I remember everything that happened and I've played it in my mind on a loop. So it's just sort of a practice of, dictation. So, but it was important for me to tell that story because that story, it's not, in my mind, at least, not just a story of a gunfight. It's what that gunfight, came to mean for all of those of us who participated in it.
It drove home the burden of command. I'm a guy you just met and haven't given you much of a background on anything that I've been involved in, but I've stepped into the role of leader coaching over time, and I drew a lot of the things that I used and taught. And I guess if I'd have anything as a reaction to say is that it was leading as you experienced, is wading through the gray and then making decisions when they have to be made. And at that point, I would tell folks that you distill the world into black and white, make the best decision you can at the time, and then move forward and bear the burden of that decision. And I don't know if it needs saying, and if me saying it matters one lick. But I read through recognizing that you distilled the gray into black and white and you did what needed doing. I hope you don't spend too much time second guessing yourself anymore about that, Elliot. The feelings are real and I wouldn't want to push them aside for you. But
I appreciate that. I think because you bring it up, and maybe it's outside the scope of this podcast, but command is a unique beast because I've worked for a lot of great commanders, and I always aspired to be the best commander I could be. And the ones I worked for, I would say that I thought were great was what distinguished them was not what they necessarily did, but what they didn't do. Mm-hmm. In so much as the ones who knew when there were decisions that were black and white and decisions that everyone else could make and, tasks that other people could do, they would just let their subordinates do it and they would empower the subordinates. But there would always be these certain moments where you knew they were the one who had to call the ball. When it was gray, they had to say whether it was black and white in really tough situations. When I look back at all of my time, in the military and otherwise in various leadership positions over the years, I'll say there's probably a dozen of these types of decisions that I had to make over the year. It's not a lot, but when they land in your lap, you quickly recognize them as big ones, and you're going to always remember, which way you called it, and the burden of remembering kind of falls to you a little bit. So we talk about that scene. That's one of those dozen moments, and we were all there, and everyone remembers it. But I remember my decision, and there's a burden of remembering your decision because it's always, it's not one that's completely clear.
Yeah, there is a lot of fog.
Yeah.
Speaking of great military leaders, Elliot, throughout your book, one senior American military officer reappears again and again. Let me read a passage where we first meet him. As we filtered out among the gravestones, about 50 yards away, I noticed a Navy officer who'd been watching the ceremony. His wife stood beside him, the two of them arm in arm. From the glint of heavy gold braid on his sleeve, I could tell he was a very senior officer, but I couldn't tell exactly who he was. That is, until I stepped a bit closer. Throughout the ceremony, Admiral Mike Mullen, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, had been watching at a distance so as to not draw any attention to himself. He was then America's senior-most military officer, responsible for the war. He'd never met any of us, yet he'd carved out time to attend the funeral with his wife. He did so without any fanfare, so their presence wouldn't distract from the ceremony. It was just the two of them. Before I could point out the Admiral to anyone else, he was gone. A black SUV idling nearby whisked him back to his office in the Pentagon. Admiral Mike Mullen, then the 17th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, first at a funeral, then in his office, and then from afar, through text messages, in the waning days of the military withdrawal from Afghanistan. Could you please share with us the significance of Admiral Mike Mullen in your book?
Well, before last summer, he and I had come to know each other just sort of, casually and politely over the years. And then as everything happened in Kabul, he and I were put back in touch because a group I was working with had some success evacuating people. And he had an interpreter that he was trying to get out as well. So that put us back in touch in some ways. So, we were in the same trench together, which was a unique experience for me because it caused me to reflect on these times in my life when he had popped up. And one of which was at the funeral of a friend of mine who I write about in the book, a guy named Garrett Lawton, who we call Tubes. Seeing him was one of the classiest things I've ever seen in my life, and certainly in my time in uniform. He did not have to be there. He showed up at Arlington. He didn't show up with any fanfare. He just stood with his wife far enough away so he'd be out of the way and not draw any attention, and just to pay his respects to a fallen Marine who he didn't know. It always stuck with me. When I met him later, I told him, hey, you don't know me, but I just want you to know when you did that, how much it was appreciated, because no one's going to come up to the chairman and kind of give him an attaboy or thank him in that moment. But so it was poignant to me, again, to use my wife's word, to then at the end of the war, be working with him on something to try to get people out. And it was this flattening too, where I'm sure and many of your listeners probably know this, but for those who don't, if you're a captain in the Marine Corps, the distance between you and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is like the distance between planet Earth and Pluto. It's a very far distance. So to then see this sort of collapse of hierarchy at the end of the war, and to all sort of be in this foxhole together, texting and trying to get folks out to kind of salvage some sense of like, well, we tried to make it right at the end. It was very, very poignant. A word that I have used when people ask me, like, is there a word to summarize the end of Afghanistan? And to me, it's been collapse. That's the word I've settled on. It was a collapse of American moral credibility, in my view. It was a collapse of American competence in how things were handled at the airport. It was when I say handle the airport, I don't mean how the Marines and soldiers were performing at the airport, but I mean like the plan that was implemented was a collapse of our this was not a competent, there were competent measures were not put in place so this could be run well. It was a collapse of time because suddenly I'm back in the war where I haven't been in more than 10 years. And it was this collapse of hierarchy where it didn't matter what your rank was. Everyone's just on the text chains trying to get things done. And, the admiral sending pen drops and the general's making phone calls and the congressman is making photocopies and taking pictures of them with the phone to get this person or that person out. So collapse is this word that I've settled on. And I wanted to include the story of Admiral Mullen in the book. First of all, because I have a lot of respect for him. And second, I just wanted to I think he sort of shows this collapsing. Because the second time you see him in the book, I'm in his office when he's the chairman, and I assure you, walking into the chairman's office is very intimidating. They've got that thing set up pretty well, so you feel like you're going to go see Caesar.
Yeah, I was on the joint staff, bird dog and public affairs for General Cartwright, the vice chairman at the time. So
yeah,
2 years. 2 years in, I never felt you don't just like skip on into either of those offices. But I was pleased and not at all surprised to hear that particular example captured. Those two leaders in particular, that's where I had the frame of experience, but they made a concerted effort to do exactly what you laid out, which was to acknowledge and to try and stay close, but also to not interfere and not disrupt. They were so painfully aware that their mere presence would make it into something completely different. But they went through a regular rotation of one of them, if at all possible, was at Dover every time a flight came in. Sometimes they had to send somebody else from the joint staff, but their standing rule was if one of us can go, we're going. And that often happened, on zero notice. Like, we're getting on a plane to Dover now, and I went with them on a couple of occasions, but they would do that on regular trips. And I know it was their effort at that senior level to try and find that connection and to stay in touch with what it was they were asking. Because at that stage, most of them many of the more senior folks hadn't deployed into those conflicts. They were truly the headquarters folks, pulling the strings and pushing the buttons on it all. But I appreciated you sharing that aspect of it as well. I think Admiral Mullen would probably read that and kind of be like, head down. I don't need to be flagged. But I do know that they took that effort to try and stay in touch, and I'm glad it had that impact on you.
Well, let me just say here, going back to the role of Admiral Mike Mullen in your book, Elliot, I thought, as you laid out for us, how incredibly powerfully illustrative it was, as you write in that chapter where you're in his office, this tremendously powerful individual who has vast responsibilities over the most fearsome war machine mankind has ever seen. And towards the end of your book, he is right there alongside everyone else in the gray, trying to help an individual, an Afghan he cares about. And I'm not here to talk about or compare chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from one to another, but one memory that I have that will stay with me is of Mark Miley in the aftermath of the withdrawal, going down at his own behest to meet with Afghan refugees arriving in Washington, D.C. There was no reason, there was no gain for him to do so. It was not part of his brief in his role for our country. It was just him as an individual, as a person who fought in that war, who wanted to go and make that connection with a people that we had at one point a pact with. And it was incredibly moving. And along that line of thought of the emotional investment that many of us who spent time working and living in Afghanistan, whether in uniform as you did, along with Cliff and so many others, brave men and women, or myself as a civilian and with some family history rooted in that country, there is a lot of emotion. There's a lot of anger. I certainly, to this day, have to wrestle with my disappointment, my anger, and my pain over what happened. And that kind of leads me into this next question that I have for you. For many years, Afghanistan and the grim sacrifices being made there by our men and women fell away from the national conversation. You pointedly confront this disinterest in the fifth act, writing, "The Washington Post opens its story with the following. A confidential trove of government documents reveals that senior U.S. officials failed to tell the truth about the war in Afghanistan throughout the 18-year campaign, making rosy pronouncements they knew to be false, in hiding unmistakable evidence the war had become unwinnable." Inherent in this statement is the logic that the American people were misled, and because they were misled, they gave successive administrations their consent to continue prosecuting the war. What is unspoken in this logic is that if the American people knew how poorly the war was going, they would have mobilized to end it, much as they mobilized to eventually end the Vietnam War. That mobilization never comes for Afghanistan. This isn't because of a lack of truth or of facts. It is because of a lack of interest. As Kabul falls, it is disorienting to see Americans newly interested in Afghanistan. Policymakers and military professionals certainly deserve blame for this debacle. And yet, the American people share the burden of this blame too. Do you still believe it is fair to blame the American people at large when our own government has carefully crafted a military machine that exists well outside our daily lived experiences as Americans?
Well, I think ultimately it is our country. So we've shown a capacity to care about certain issues. Look at 2020 and what we just lived through after the killing of George Floyd. I mean, a national mobilization to change the conversation around race in this country. I mean, look at the gay rights movement and the huge changes in American society in the last 10 years for those rights. So the American people, when they want to mobilize and care about something, they can care. Now, I go into the link of the book. Successive administrations have certainly engineered war making in a specific way in the United States. And the reason the forever wars were forever wars is not because we couldn't figure out the necessary alchemy for victory in Afghanistan or victory in Iraq. They're the forever wars because they were engineered by our political leaders to be forever wars, meaning wars that were politically easy to wage, in which the American people were anesthetized to their costs in terms of blood and treasure, blood and all volunteer military. So increasingly, a separate cast of American citizens are fighting these wars, and treasure, all these wars, their costs go onto the national deficit. So there's no war tax. So there has been anesthetization that's occurred. But just because a segment of American society is anesthetized to something that is morally compromised that another section of the society is doing doesn't mean you get off the hook. Just because you live in a gated community doesn't mean you don't have an obligation to care about issues that exist outside your gated community. It doesn't mean you're suddenly not a citizen because the issue doesn't affect you. These are American issues. These wars were fought in the name of Americans. If people don't want to engage with the issue, that's a choice too. And in Afghanistan, by and large, most Americans did not engage with the issue over years and years and years, decades. And the result is what happened there this summer. And I think that morally compromises, America. I don't think you can just put this on one small group of Americans or tell, the majority of Americans that they're off the hook because their government did X, Y, or Z. Ultimately, it's your government. That's where I'm at on the issue.
I'm there with you. I came from the public affairs side of things, and we were not spin doctors, in my opinion, or I wasn't. The people I served with weren't. The door was open on the early end of that, where we had embeds and open access and timely public access. America wasn't interested.
No, they weren't interested. I've read war too. People were not interested for years. No interest.
I recall being back at TUMEF, Second Two Marine Expeditionary Force in Camp Lejeune, where we hit the mile markers of I think the 2,000 and 3,000th service member killed or some such, and that was the media thing. And they came out. We did a whole barrage of the media came to the base like, oh, it's this person, and we tried to get the point across that there was nothing magical about the number 2,000 or whatnot, that individual was just as important as everyone before. That wasn't the deal. The headline was here, and the public interest and what people would stop and watch on TV. It was something else. But we the people are responsible for what happened there. Yeah.
And, and I think it's important to be cognizant of the way these wars were, the way they were built, the construct around them as we think of how we prosecute war in this country. Every war this country has fought from the revolution to the present day has had to have a construct to sustain it. You look at the Civil War. In the Civil War, that construct was the first ever draft comes out of the Civil War and first ever income tax. World War II, a national mobilization and a bond drive. Vietnam, very unpopular draft. The war on terror, all volunteer military funded through deficit spending. Mm-hmm. And it's worth asking in the future, is that the best way for us to fight a war? Do we run a certain moral hazard if we choose to fight our war that way? And strategically speaking, is that going to cause us to engage in a war that we can't seem to end? Because, and I think also people, oftentimes it's not intuitive that it can be much easier to keep a war going than to end it, politically speaking.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
The second half of the Vietnam War and these wars.
I think it's quite telling that we have neither declared nor won a war since World War II. Folks will call me out on that argument of the which, the where. We won Grenada, all right, and the Gulf War, did we? Operationally, we were successful in doing the thing we set out to do, but no declaration, and ultimately ended up fighting those folks again. Yeah, it was engineered, absolutely. And yet the responsibility, I think, for the American public is still there. It was engineered in a way that made it easy for us collectively to ignore it.
That's right. I was saying, and then it gets into these very interesting questions of what does it mean to end a war? So for instance, right now, it seems to be that Afghanistan and Iraq are over and Syria's over the war, it's over. And the president goes on TV and says, this is the first time that America hasn't been in war in 20 years. Yeah. You're like, what? We still have troops in lots of these places. But in Afghanistan, what did it mean to end the war? The war would be over when the last soldier came home and there were no Americans in Afghanistan. Who says that's what it means to necessarily end the war? I mean, again, in World War II, obviously we still have a huge footprint in Europe. And so, but because that became the narrative, it boxed us in strategically in certain ways, which I could go on about, at length. And I think, and again, contributed to sort of a debacle of a withdrawal because, for us, winning the war was sort of, first of all, we set an arbitrary date, but in some ways we set a little bit of an arbitrary metric on what winning the war or ending the war would mean.
Well, I'd go so far as to say we changed the metrics on an annual basis. It was, we fought 21-year wars. Yes. Rather than committing to a 15-year one and saying, here's the goal. And if we haven't reached it in 15, we're out. And maybe the American public would have said no to a 15-year commitment. But by saying yes to a short one, they got 20 years. And we could hoist beers over this one for hours and hours and, drink our livers away, I think. The fact remains that folks like yourself served well and waded through the gray to distill it into black and white when you had to make hard decisions in the now. And I guess that's the best way I've found to articulate it with folks who, fellow Marines, other service members. I spent a lot of purple time at the end who were saying it was a waste. And I can't let myself believe it was a waste for us individually, because our service in the now meant what it will always mean. But then at the same time, that's a little bit of verbal or something gymnastics, because in the end of it, if we didn't achieve what we set out to achieve, then what was the purpose?
Your book, as of this recording, has yet to come out. By the time listeners will hear this, it will be August 9th, once your book formally releases nationwide and both globally. We're nearing the 1-year anniversary of America's end in Afghanistan. How do you think fundamentally this book could help those readers without any attachment to Afghanistan better understand our experiences? And what value do you think this book will have for those that served and sacrificed?
I want people to understand just some of the human stories here. We often talk about Afghanistan as a geopolitical problem, or, an American involvement there as a geopolitical problem, and in highly intellectualized terms. And now, and that's all well and good. But, this is about people. It's about groups of people. It's about young families trying to start their lives and get away from the Taliban. It's about people who serve there, trying to make good on what they felt were promises made a long time ago that, they won't turn their backs on. I just want, I want people to read those stories and hopefully feel something as they read them. And maybe if they feel something when they read them, they'll remember them. And I hope that this book, the next time we go to war, we're remembering what we did last time. I've always felt that When I was kind of coming into the military and when I was younger, the war that had just been fought was the Vietnam War. And those were the stories that were being told. And the folks who'd been there, they were the custodians of that memory. And I feel like as these things happen, you become a custodian of certain memories. And so for, all of us who were involved in what happened last summer, we have those memories. And I hope many of these types of books and stories are told so that those memories stay fresh, because someday on our nation's horizon, and I hope it's far off on our horizon, but who knows when it's going to be, we're going to be talking about another war. Someone's going to have crossed us internationally and we're going to want to go to war. And I'm not someone who's necessarily anti-war in all cases, but I think you got to go into it with your eyes wide open. And I hope people can look back at these stories and understand them, just as when I was younger, we were always looking back at Vietnam and trying to understand it. So, this book is a contribution to that, and just a human document as well, stories of the people who were there.
What I appreciate about the Fifth Act, America's End in Afghanistan, is the fact that America's End in Afghanistan was an incredible defeat, unprecedented since the end of the Vietnam War. Mark Miley went before our Congress and the American people and very pointedly said, the war is lost. It deserves to remain a point of concern for our country, the history of our country, the fact that we fought a 20-year war, the fact that 2,000 men and women gave their lives in that war, more than 2,000 gave their lives in this war, and this was the outcome. It's a dark chapter in our nation's history. But what I appreciate what you did with the Fifth Act is that you could have focused on the stories where your efforts, along with those of your colleagues, failed in terms of trying to get Afghans to safety into the airport. But you very purposely highlighted those stories where it worked. And I think the reason why I appreciated that so much in your book, because it is such a bleak story, such a bleak chapter of our history, is that you want to lift up the importance of simply trying to do good where you can, and what can come of it and how it can help shape or save a life. And I think that is one thing that I really do appreciate about how you constructed this book. Finally, we're nearing the end of our time here. I'm going once again to try and be brief. I was part of this experience alongside yourself and so many others here in the United States and across the world. My father was in Kabul at the time. So many of my friends and colleagues were at the airport trying to get in. Some did, some did not. Many remained left behind or scattered to the winds. And amongst that moment was a wonderful soldier, wounded veteran by the name of Chris McClanton, lost his legs in an IED blast and was in those weeks trying to help his interpreter, Ramal, get to the other side of the airport. It's now the end of July, and Ramal is still in Kabul, and Chris is still trying to get him out. Your book is an accounting of some of the lives you and your colleagues and total strangers helped save. But as you know, there's still a lot more work to be done to get those that deserve to leave out of Afghanistan. Could you suggest how we can best assist those that remain stuck on bases around the world and in Taliban-held Afghanistan as we conclude this interview with you?
I think, first of all, there's, the things that we can do most tangibly, in the United States is, legislation like the Afghan Adjustment Act. To allow, at least help the people who've gotten out and help funnel the people here or to wherever they want to be resettled who have made it out of Afghanistan itself. And, our legislative leaders, our national leadership should get together and get that job done, because we have a clear moral obligation to do so. And an incredible incentive to do so. These people are going to come to the United States. They're going to be incredible Americans. And, at a time in our country's history where, we need people to come here and contribute and work. So why would we not do this? But then there is the larger question of what do we do for the people who are still inside Afghanistan, a country where we have no official presence and no national capacity outside of the faithfulness of individuals who just refuse to quit and refuse to, leave that last person behind, who refuse to stop taking the phone call or answering the text message or grasping at the threads. And those people, I think, will continue to do so. As you know, as we situate this moment, kind of what I keep coming back to is, so we're talking about other wars. I think there's a little bit of a parallel with the POW MIA movement after the Vietnam War. I mean, this was a war that didn't have any POWs or MIAs in any meaningful way, and there's none that are unaccounted for. People who are unaccounted for in Afghanistan are our Afghan allies. And just as America has maintained a very large POW MIA vigil for decades now, I think it's time we start talking about taking up a similar vigil for our Afghan allies who are trapped inside of Afghanistan.
Elliot, thank you for charting a possible way forward as we continue to navigate this rupture in our country's history. I think that fundamentally, the message in your book persists here too. Don't give up. Keep trying.
I want to close with a thank you for the book, a thank you for your candor and your openness in exploring and explaining the things you experienced and weaving them together in such a way that is a literary masterpiece, in my opinion. And part of that mastery is making it digestible to folks who weren't there. And it'll be on my daughter's reading list. She's 10 now, but when I have to try and explain as she starts to understand, it'll be one that I hand her and say, let me walk you through this. So thank you for that. And on that, I'll hand back to Wise and see where we're headed.
I just personally want to thank you again for once again coming to this small secret garden that Cliff and I now maintain together, and providing us your time and sharing with us your work. And as I've said many a time in the past, I look forward and hope that I'll have the privilege of charting your path forward as an artist and author in the years ahead. I want to wish you well, and I just want to join Cliff and acknowledge the fact that I'm so very glad you have a loving family around you who sustains you and lifts you up, and may they continue to do so and provide you the support you need to keep on writing.
Thank you, guys. It's just always a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to the next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Ask. Since August of 2021, I have struggled to find the answers for those left behind. They include Farouk, Ali Ahmad, Suhal, Monica, Zalmai, Fatima, and Ahmed. Lastly, this episode of The Ask has a fifth act too. I would like to read you a note I received last week, much like the many I've received since August of last year. It begins, Salam brothers Waisazimi and Tamim. I hope you are well and healthy. Waisazimi, I got my KBL a month ago, and I've been waiting to receive a passport for my daughter for the last 5 months. Fortunately, I received her passport 2 days ago. Now, I am 100% eligible to be evacuated. I have all required documents for me and my family to travel. I have filled the DS-260 form as well. Now I am fully confident that one day I will be out of Afghanistan. Waisazimi, as you know, I was followed by 2 Talibs, and they shot 4 bullets at me in January. After that, I left my house and went to my father-in-law, and I am there till now. 2 weeks ago, 3 Taliban came to my house and asked my father about me. They said to my father that we know your son was working with foreigners. Tell him don't hide, come and work for us. We announced a public amnesty and won't harm him. I know this is a trap. My father said that my son is not in Afghanistan and he left the country 2 years ago. I face ongoing threats. If they find out my living place, or if they know that my father has provided them false information, it won't be good for me and my family. 2 days ago, I went to the Kabul passport department. While I was waiting for my turn, a Talib looked at me and asked me to give him my cell phone. He said that all who come to receive passports worked with foreigners and want to escape from Islamic rule. I resisted and said that I have some personal photos. He beat me with his gun and let me go only after some other people intervened. Waisazimi, it's been 1 year that I am living in darkness and fear. I've explained to you my situation many times, brother, and you tried to send me and my family to a safe house. But unfortunately, I did not have calm approval at that time and did not complete the requirements to be in a safe house or be evacuated. I know that you tried your best to help me at that time. Now, I not only have my approved KBL, but all necessary travel documents. You know, the most hard thing is to break all bridges behind you and leave behind your entire life. Leave your father, mother, and go away and start from zero. I love my country, but cannot live here with these threats and dangers. Brother Waisazimi, I know you're a kind and generous person and like to help others. You are the only person I and Tamim rely on and count on. Please help rescue my and my family's lives. Please help me to be included in the CARE team upcoming flight lists. I won't forget your generous support for the rest of my life. Once again, thank you for your kindness and continuous help and support. Mohammed. For those listening to this podcast and wish to help Afghan refugees here in the United States, I urge you to visit welcome.us and find out how you can help. Even against the great tide of history, we all still have the freedom to try and help. And it all matters.